Francisco Franco was one of the most enigmatic dictators in European history. Even today, Spain still shoulders the burden of his dark legacy.
The impact of his regime is tremendous to this day.
A bloody civil war made him supreme leader. He then used every available means to retain power.
He saw himself as the savior of Spain. Franco did not want to relinquish power. He clung to it to the very end.
When the despot died in 1975, he left behind a divided country and took many secrets with him to the grave. After the Second World War, Franco, an admirer of Adolf Hitler, had to look for new partners. But they had their own specific interest in Spain. The Caudillo's regime adapted to the global situation, and in doing so, came under pressure internally. The dictator had grown old. The question of a successor was an issue he dealt with personally. But the young king, by the grace of Franco, had his own plans for Spain's future. After many years of stagnation, in the 1950s, Spain too experienced an economic upswing, boosted by capital from abroad. Franco's foreign policy successes opened up new perspectives and cemented his grip on power. The dictator ruled like a monarch. The El Pardo, the royal palace, served as a perfect backdrop. Here, self-confident and aloof, Franco took center stage. Much to the annoyance of the Spanish royal house. In the unrest that preceded the Civil War, King Alfonso XIII had gone into exile. Since the king's death, Alfonso's son Juan had laid claim to the throne. From his residence in Portugal, he insisted that Franco keep an old promise and re-establish the monarchy.
Franco never intended to restore the monarchy because it would have diminished his own power. However, to keep the monarchists happy, in 1947, he passed a law which was called the Law of Succession, which declared that Spain was a kingdom, but that it was a kingdom without a king, that would have a regent in the person of Francisco Franco Baramonde.
But Don Juan secured a perspective for his family's future. In 1948, he agreed to send his son, Juan Carlos, to Franco. His own liberal views ruled out Don Juan himself as a successor.
Effectively, what Franco is saying to Don Juan, if you ever want to be on the throne, if you want your family to come back and be on the throne, you let me have your son and you let me train your son in the ways that I want.
Franco took Juan Carlos under his wing. He received the necessary drill at elite schools and military academies. The prince was a kind of security for the dictator. He protected Franco from any over-hasty claims by the royal house. The caudillo regarded his own claim to power as incontestable.
Franco saw himself as absolutely essential to the peace of Spain. And like any long-serving dictator, he always felt that as soon as he was gone, there was going to be chaos.
Franco was convinced that the people stood behind him. Thanks to foreign aid, living conditions in Spain had improved. Surely that had to ensure loyalty. But Spanish society was changing. the regime faced new challenges.
The time for a new generation first had to come, and we were that generation, those born during the Civil War. We were not scarred by the reign of terror. We'd not experienced the repression that occurred during the war and afterwards, so we were bolder.
In 1956, the University of Madrid became the first scene of unrest. Its students called for freedom and democracy. In the eyes of the dictator, that was tantamount to patricide, because the demonstrators came from the very upper class he had always favored. The parents were loyal followers of Franco, but their offspring were suddenly protesting.
We wanted democratization, democratic parties and so on. We didn't have any concrete concept. We just wanted a normal democratic country like France, post-war Germany and Italy.
But it was actually the fascist party that held sway at Spain's universities, because Franco also used his phalangists to control the country's academic life. And they shared the caudillo's mistrust of the universities, which were seen as potential breeding grounds for dangerous left-wing ideas. The student protests in Madrid had to be ended as quickly as possible, if necessary, by force.
The Falange was afraid of the protests gathering momentum, so it occupied the university. When I arrived, it was full of armed phalangists in uniform. They'd taken over the entire university. We students were sitting in a lecture theater when the phalangists suddenly began to pummel us. We put up resistance, and a real battle ensued. Tables and chairs were smashed. We picked up the chair legs and attacked the phalangists with them. The university was completely taken apart.
The resistance could not be stifled from one day to the next. At the universities, camps once hostile to one another now formed a broad alliance against Franco. The police had been ordered to cut back on torture and political murder. This gave the workers more and more courage to resist. Franco's inflationary policies were having a dramatic impact on ordinary Spanish people. Prices were rising day by day, but wages remained static. In 1956, workers in several industrial centers downed tools. The regime was beginning to feel the anger of the masses. Luis Romero experienced the start of the protests as a farm laborer in Andalusia. Like many others, he hoped to find better working conditions in Barcelona.
In the 1950s, farm laborers gradually began to mobilize. Now everyone wanted to earn at least a certain amount of money, not just for the cash itself, but out of pure necessity. Things moved a lot faster in industry because more labor was needed there. So lots of workers came together. In a factory, it was much easier for us to protest and make demands of all kinds.
But the strikers and demonstrators did not represent all Spaniards. Many were still Franquistas. "20 years of war and despotism had left deep scars. Millions of Spaniards had come to terms with the regime. They did not believe that the dictatorship would end all that quickly.
After Spain signed the agreement with the United States, that was regarded as unlikely. As long as the Americans supported Franco, the regime would not simply embrace democracy, which is what many people in Spain wanted. So they simply focused on everyday life instead of thinking politically.
For many, football was a welcome distraction. In the mid-50s, the international successes of Real Madrid and Barcelona were celebrated frenetically. The emotional experience of sport united the nation, especially as the state had no influence over what happened on the field. Most Spaniards were more interested in their local club than in big politics.
What always fascinated me was that no matter what part of Spain you were in, everyone told you that the most important thing in a man's life was to become president of the local football club.
Franco's propaganda machine quickly realized the potential that presented itself and sought close relations with Spain's top clubs. Their triumphs were to be Franco's triumphs, success in which the caudillo could bask. Football is popular worldwide, and the dictatorship also used the sport to polish its image abroad.
At the time, you were top dog. You played for Real Madrid. You were league champions. You're the best, they said, the greatest. After all, we represented Real Madrid, and whether you were a foreigner or not, you also represented Spain. Naturally, strict guidelines were laid down as to how we had to behave.
But in the long run, the impressive triumphs on the pitch could not mask the economic problems. Towards the end of the decade, the upswing of the early 50s was followed by the next crisis. Because of Franco's inflationary politics, prices soared. Now it wasn't just the lower classes who faced impending poverty. Half the country was affected. Franco had to get a grip of the supply situation, even if it meant Spain sliding further into debt. The country had to import expensive industrial goods, from Germany, for example. But for its part, Spain had little more to offer than citrus fruits. More and more loans were needed, and sooner or later, the state would be bankrupt.
The regime noticed that it had to do something, not because of the unbridled inflation, but because it had no foreign exchange. It had medium-term debts. We're talking about 5 years. Spain had no way of securing foreign exchange, and there was no alternative. Pursuing self-sufficiency with the Falange was out of the question.
Franco was in deep trouble. If his dictatorship was to survive, he had to allow reforms. In 1957, the dictator took drastic measures and replaced 12 out of 18 ministers. For the first time, he filled cabinet posts not with minions, but with experts.
Franco is 65. It's the time when most people retire. Things have changed. Franco is no longer capable of running such a society. He needs technocrats. He needs technicians who will do the job.
The new ministers had a radical plan. They wanted to open up the Spanish market internationally so that the economy could at last develop. The aim was to improve living standards and thus stifle protest. Many of the reformers belonged to Opus Dei, a lay organization of the Catholic Church, whose members were regarded as particularly secretive. In Spain, Opus Dei was especially powerful. With Franco's indulgence since the early 50s, more and more members of Opus Dei had been occupying key positions in government and society. In its its own educational facilities, the Catholic organization trained young people for leadership roles and imparted an elitist conception of the world. Its founder, José Escrivá, had set his sights on Spain's highly educated elite right from the start. This is where he recruited his followers. The aim was for them to occupy key positions and control the state's destiny. Opus Dei gave Franco's conservative Christian cause its full support.
There was no question of them having a completely free market, because being Opus Dei, the one thing they did not want to have was anything which was basically anti-regime or anti-Catholic in that particular way, so it was extremely controlled.
The planned reforms were solely of an economic nature. They were designed primarily to maintain the dictatorship. But even so, the pious gentlemen had a lot of trouble convincing Franco of their plan.
It was made plain to him that he could no longer drive in his car because the country had no petrol. The supplies weren't forthcoming. He was also told that as people became increasingly dissatisfied, political unrest would increase. Only then was he prepared to accept economic change, but he never actually supported it.
The driving force behind the reform was a long-standing, loyal supporter of Franco, Admiral Carrero Blanco, a Catholic who had paved the way for Opus Dei to enter the regime's leadership circle.
Franco felt that at last he had found somebody who would perpetuate his regime and his idea of total political and social stagnation.
Up to this point, the regime in Spain had been oriented entirely towards its head, the caudillo Francisco Franco. This made it vulnerable. Carrero's technocrats were now thinking of the future. Who would succeed Franco one day? In their eyes, Prince Juan Carlos was merely one of several candidates. His liberal father, Don Juan, could have a negative influence on the young man. So, Franco too had his doubts about Juan Carlos's loyalty. Could he really trust his protégé? Franco was nearing 70, which fueled speculation about his successor. The dictator's family also drew public attention. When Franco's daughter Carmencita presented the caudillo with a grandson, the race for the throne again seemed totally open. Franco himself never said a word. He didn't want to rush. Instead, he continued to keep a quiet watch on the candidates. The reformers of Opus Dei knew that the future of the regime also depended on their success. Only an end to the economic hardship would break the people's desire for freedom and their spirit of resistance. But initially, opening up the market only aggravated the crisis. Many found it even harder to feed their family. Once again, the main victims were the workers and small-scale entrepreneurs. Thousands lost their job. Many businesses suddenly became unprofitable and had to close.
So it became clear that something had to be done about these people who had become unemployed and who constituted an unrest factor. And as historical coincidence would have it, this was a time when the rest of Europe was experiencing an economic upswing.
Industry was booming virtually all over Europe, but not on the Iberian Peninsula. The West European economic miracle had passed by Spain. It was in this situation that Franco discovered a new export commodity: labor. The main destination countries for Spanish work immigrants were Switzerland, West Germany, and France. Great Britain and the Benelux countries also accepted guest workers from Spain. In the 1960s, nearly 1.5 million Spaniards left their homeland, a historic peak. At first, West Germany reacted cautiously to inquiries from Franco's state, placing more faith instead in workers from Italy. It was not until the early 80s that the government in Bonn also concluded a labor recruitment agreement with Madrid.
In Köln richteten sich unsere Kameras auf 2 Sonderzüge mit mehr als 1100 spanischen und portugiesischen Gastarbeitern. Wie kein anderes europäisches Industrieland ist die Bundesrepublik mit ihren mehr als 600.000 freien Stellen auf sie angewiesen.
José Beltrán only returned to his Spanish homeland as a pensioner. Today, he looks after the interests of guest workers worldwide. At the age of 25, Beltrán left Madrid for Oberhausen.
I left to see a different world and to have more opportunities. Here I was badly off. I'd never have been able to own a car. I had no money, and there were no cars anyway.
In 1962, he quickly settled in with a German family. But many of his colleagues regarded their time abroad merely as a temporary phase in their lives, just a brief stay.
Most of them came from villages in the Extremadura or Andalusia. They were good, hard-working people who led simple lives. They wanted to return to Spain quickly with the money they had saved because they'd left their families and their children behind. That was tough.
Most of the guest workers had hardly any contact with German society. Nevertheless, life in a democracy was a defining experience.
Back then, it was mainly young people who left to work abroad. They had absolutely no idea about politics. But in France or in Germany, they experienced a totally different reality. There were trade unions and political parties. They became members of the CGT, for instance. They experienced freedom and trained as activists. Then they returned to Spain and often played an important role in the workers' struggle. Their politicization had taken place in Germany, Switzerland, or France.
The money from guest workers was extremely welcome in Franco's Spain. But their experience of the freedoms of the West could prove dangerous. Franco placed his faith in patriotism.
Quiero hacer llegar mi voz con la felicitación y los votos de la patria a los españoles más alejados, a los dispersos por el mundo, a los trabajadores que persiguiendo un bienestar mayor trabajan fuera de la nación, con la promesa para todos de seguir forjando la patria grande que, corrigiendo injusticias, derrame sus bienes sobre todos los españoles. Para todos, el abrazo de la patria y el mío personal.
In order to bind the guest workers to their homeland, holiday trips to Spain were offered, along with lots of small presents.
The Spanish government sent show groups, on Christmas Eve, for example, to places in Germany where lots of Spanish people lived. It was like a small Spanish celebration. They did it to ingratiate themselves with the Spanish guest workers, who sent a lot of money home, and in doing so helped Spain out of its economic crisis.
In the 1960s alone, guest workers sent the equivalent of 26.5 billion euros back to Spain. Fresh capital and a breath of fresh air. The end of protectionism at last paid off. Spain received more loans from abroad and also achieved greater revenues itself. Tourism especially brought in foreign exchange. Summer after summer since the late 50s, more and more foreigners had been spending their holidays on Spain's beaches. tourism had become far and away the most important growth sector. Back then, many Germans discovered Mallorca, which soon became their favorite island. Former tour guide Hans Birkhäuser experienced the early days as Mallorca developed into a holiday paradise, with dubious experts from abroad.
When I came to Mallorca for the first time in 1956, I was amazed to hear not Spanish, English or French being spoken, but Flemish. According to what my colleagues told me, those speaking Flemish must have been former soldiers of the Flanders SS division. A few of them who had fled to Spain in good time before the end of the war had opened an agency which functioned so efficiently and reliably that the Spaniards could only learn from it.
For many, holidaying in a dictatorship was not a problem.
Back then, it was the Minister of Tourism, Fraga Iribarne, who coined the famous slogan, España es diferente. Spain is different. He wanted to revive the romantic cliché, but the slogan also had a political connotation. We are different in every way. We also have a different political system. But if you come to us, that is something you will have to accept.
But the many bikini-clad girls full of the joys of life also constituted a threat. While economic reformers were attracting more and more tourists to the country, the regime feared the decline of traditional values.
He was extremely uneasy about what effect this would have on Spanish youth. The idea that other people could travel, the pop music that was coming in, the clothing and all the rest of it, all of this completely undermined, in his view, the basis of what Spanish society should be.
Franco and the church did not want any Western-style decline in moral standards, so surveillance was called for.
You often saw the Guardia Civil. You would recognize them by their conspicuous tricornio hats. When I first came, they kept a close eye on what was happening on the beaches. Back then, kissing and cuddling and so on was seen as unacceptable. As time passed, though, things changed. I saw for myself how, as the number of tourists increased, the Guardia Civil turned a blind eye more and more and didn't really bother.
Tourists were into sun and fun. Hardly anyone was interested in Franco's prisons.
Jeder zweite deutsche Flugtourist hat oder hatte in diesem Sommer ein Ticket für Mallorca in der Tasche. An manchen Tagen bringen annähernd 100 Charter- oder Linienmaschinen 10.000 Touristen auf die Sonneninsel.
Thanks to inexpensive package offers, more and more holidaymakers could afford to fly to the Mediterranean. By 1960, the annual number of tourists had already reached 6 million. And the boom continued. With hotel capacities on the Mediterranean stretched, the government had to react. The following year broke all records. By 1975, the number of tourists had increased fivefold to 30 million a year. In view of this bonanza, by and large, Franco gave tourism free rein. This resulted in the uncontrolled construction of ugly giant hotels. Many Spanish people were far from happy at their coasts being concreted over. But the tourist invasion also played a major role in getting the impoverished country back on its feet.
The Spanish economy now grew in a way that was unique in the 20th century. Back then, an average economic growth rate of around 7% was achieved, one of the highest worldwide.
The Spanish economic miracle had finally arrived. On the roads, the Seat 600 became the symbol of the boom. After years of deprivation, the people were able to breathe a sigh of relief. We've made it.
Living standards were rising. I mean, huge building projects took place of very low quality, but people no longer, as in the South, lived in caves, they lived in apartments. Of course, the Franco regime gave all the credit to Franco. This is the benevolent grandfather of his people making Spaniards happy.
The fact that Franco had been against economic openness had long been forgotten. The state media celebrated him and the boom. Had the men of Opus Dei achieved their goal? Had growing prosperity muffled criticism of the regime? Either way, the aged despot felt untouchable. Now, more and more, Franco was leaving the drudgery of day-to-day politics to his ministers. First and foremost, to Luis Carrero Blanco. As vice president, he had actually been ruling the country since 1967.
From that point on, Franco becomes a symbolic head of state. You know, all he does, he obviously spends a lot of time hunting, a lot of time fishing, huge amount of time watching TV. He has 17 televisions.
Spanish propaganda kept secret about Franco's excessive TV consumption. Instead, it portrayed his success at hunting and fishing. The grey-haired caudillo was now over 70, and he liked himself more and more in the role of grandfather of the nation. But the facade was crumbling. Many Spaniards could no longer be kept quiet with bread and games, nor through fear of state power. The model of flourishing democracies abroad stirred the desire for freedom more and more. The aging dictator was gradually losing control. Spanish society was changing. Young people in particular were protesting. Now, it wasn't only economic, but also political reforms they wanted. In the mid-60s, resistance to Franco's regime became more radical. Spain's youth was losing patience. People took to the streets nearly every day. Since the first riots in the mid-50s, protests had never really abated. It was only 10 years later, however, that they developed into a mass movement.
At the time, it even encouraged older people to participate and become organized. Many separate organizations emerged. There were citizens' initiatives, as well as political parties covering a wide range of ideologies. In this respect, our fight became visible.
The radical actions of the ETA found particular attention. The Basque underground organization had been fighting for years for more self-determination, something Franco had always denied Catalans and Basques. In 1967, ETA carried out its first bomb attacks. They were followed soon after by political murders.
ETA, at that particular stage, had a greater logic to it than, of course, it had once democracy arrived. So I don't think people necessarily sympathized with it, but they perhaps had, certainly if they were very much anti-Frankist, they certainly probably had quite a bit more admiration.
Trade unions were still banned. but the workers were becoming more of a force. Now it was no longer about pure survival. Their protests had become more political, and their goals were more ambitious. The workers' movement gradually developed into the most dangerous form of opposition to Franco. In working-class circles, even the clergy was turning against the regime. Worker priests had long supported strikers, and now bishops were openly criticizing the dictatorship. The fronts were becoming entrenched. Franco even resorted to having priests arrested. But annoying the church was something the dictator could ill afford. Criticism and protests were now coming from all sides. Franco desperately tried to get the people behind him.
Esta batalla por la paz nuestra, la que disfrutamos en el seno de nuestros hogares, es responsabilidad de todos y de cada uno de los españoles. La fidelidad permanente a estos ideales constituye nuestra interna fortaleza y no debéis tolerar nunca que nadie, ni fuera ni dentro, trate de destruirlo.
By now, though, conjuring up the old spectres and conspiracy theories only had an impact on inveterate supporters of the dictator. In Spain, one question was becoming more and more pressing. Who will succeed Francisco Franco? Franco purposely delayed naming a successor in order to restrain the vultures hovering inside and outside his government. Defiantly, he pointed out the longevity of his forefathers. Then, in July 1969, came the long-awaited address. For more than 20 years, the country had speculated about various candidates. Now, the caudillo unveiled his secret and named Juan Carlos as the successor to his throne.
He decidido proponerle a la patria como mi sucesor.
Spain breathed a sigh of relief.
Juan Carlos is king only because Franco has named him. So Franco has broken the legitimacy of the royal line. He's broken the continuity of the royal line. And effectively what he's doing, he is showing that he is greater than any king.
31-year-old Juan Carlos pledged absolute loyalty to the head of state. The new title, Prince of Spain, was created for this descendant of the Bourbon kings.
Juan Carlos, who played his cards very, very carefully, again, in a slightly frankest way of not really revealing what his true feelings were, and so therefore gave Franco the encouragement to believe that he could actually carry things on in the future.
The regime continued to keep a close eye on Juan Carlos.
Close advisors, and particularly the group that gathers around Mrs. Franco, that want to make sure that there will be no move to democratization, say to Franco, and this happens, we have a lot of evidence about this, say to Franco, be careful with this Juan Carlos. He's not to be trusted.
Franco's wife, Carmen Polo, was regarded as the center of the widespread nepotism. She and the Franco family's favorites were afraid of losing their privileges. Franco believed that he had young Juan Carlos under control because he had placed Luis Carrero as the head of government at the prince's side. The experienced hardliner was now also officially responsible for day-to-day political business and totally endorsed Francoism. Franco was convinced that his political heritage was secured, even though the regime was clearly unable to find any solution to the problems it was facing. The dictator was not prepared to introduce any democratic reforms, he again placed his faith more in the old methods, terror and violence.
Often a demonstration consisted solely of us quickly shouting a few slogans in the street and then beating a hasty retreat. Because 2 seconds later, the police were there and opened fire, and they shot to kill. The most important thing was to say nothing if we were arrested. We had to remain steadfast in order to protect our comrades.
Felisa and her fellow campaigners were repeatedly arrested and tortured for days on end. In the rest of Europe, the '68 generation was cheerfully embarking on a new beginning. But in Spain, people continued to disappear without trace.
Ich habe in dieser Zeit, die ich noch Franco leben.
During the time when Franco was in power, I often learnt that friends and relatives of players had been abducted or had disappeared.
Oder bekannten Freunden irgendwelche Spieler bei uns zusammenhingen. Wir hatten ja
Because we had players from all over Spain.
Und egal wo einer herkam.
Things like that happened everywhere.
Überall ist irgendwas passiert in der Richtung.
Information from the regime's torture chambers leaked out more and more often. One turning point was the Burgos trial in 1970. 16 ETA fighters stood before a military tribunal. They faced the death penalty. This triggered a wave of protests, not only abroad, but also in Spain itself.
Der Prozess von Burgos wirkt sich aus wie ein Katalysator, den sich die Unzufriedenheit kristallisiert, mit der zahllose Spanier, die bisher keineswegs zur Opposition gerechnet werden mussten, die Regierungspolitik der letzten 1,5 Jahre verfolgen.
How much longer could the dictatorship survive?
The Pyrenees weren't 3,000 meters high, as they are in reality. They were 10,000 meters high. What happened beyond them was always the same. In this respect, Iberia was somewhat despised. Franco was always in power. But the trial in Burgos in 1970 brought the whole issue to the world's attention for the first time.
The verdict sparked off worldwide protests. All the accused had been sentenced to death. Franco's violent regime wanted to set an example. But international pressure grew. Even the Pope intervened. A few days later, the caudillo relented and commuted the death sentences. To save the dictator's face, his propaganda machine sold Franco's decision as an act of strength. As an exception, he had shown leniency.
On a social level, that was quite successful, and it motivated us to see what else we could achieve.
The opposition believed its time had come. Franco's health was visibly fading. He was suffering from Parkinson's disease. His fragility was now almost impossible to conceal. Franco's followers had taken every measure to enable the regime to survive his death.
Respecto a la sucesión a la jefatura del Estado, sobre la que tantas maliciosas especulaciones hicieron quienes dudaron de la continuidad de nuestro movimiento, todo ha quedado atado y bien atado.
But on a December morning in 1973, Franco's plans were shattered. His faithful vice president, Admiral Carrero Blanco, was assassinated by ETA. On his way back from church, a bomb was detonated, which hurled his car high into the air.
People were afraid. What is going to happen next? What I remember is the sudden silence in the city. Everybody withdrew and waited, because something like that had been totally unexpected.
The dictator was heart-stricken and grieved for his veteran companion.
assassination, I think, probably sort of hastened Franco's death in a way, in a longer term, because I think Franco then started to give up slightly. He realized that sort of things probably weren't going to be quite the same after his death.
The power vacuum created by the assassination had to be filled quickly. Franco's wife took control. Ever since their young days, Carmen Polo had been seen as the driving force behind her husband. He rarely took a decision against her will.
A name would come up and Franco would say, who's that? And she'd say, oh, for God's sake, Paco, he's the man we made foreign minister. So there is no doubt that she had an immense influence over him.
Carmen Polo picked up where the assassinated Carrero Blanco had left off. Her government team guaranteed a tough line, even after Franco's death. With her help, the ultra-conservatives won the internal struggle. Violence against critics of the regime assumed extreme forms. Nevertheless, to the persecuted, a new political dawn seemed within reach. Franco played golf. In 1974, dictatorships ended in 2 other countries, Portugal and Greece. But no reaction was forthcoming from Spain's dictator. No reforms, no abdication.
Ging über den Golfplatz.
He played golf. At least once a day, he would wave down from his balcony and greet someone.
Irgendjemand begrüßt. Jeden Tag.
He was always present to lull people, and in this way, to gain time.
Eben auf diesem Weg zumindest für die Straße und auf der Straße Zeit zu gewinnen.
He never considered stepping down or making any significant changes. That gave many people who were depoliticized some peace of mind. Nothing else will happen. Everything will continue as before. At the same time, however, when his illness became manifest, a big question mark arose. People knew something would happen soon, but they didn't know what.
Many people were worried. Would Franco's death open up the old wounds of the Civil War? After all, Spain was still divided into camps, deeply hostile to one another.
There's a total difference between those who are the supporters, who are obviously frightened about what's going to happen when Franco is out of the way, and all of those who are longing for the old bastard to die.
On the 39th anniversary of its assumption of power, the regime mobilized the masses once again. This great gesture of national solidarity was also designed to intimidate the regime's critics. For over 40 years, the victor of the Civil War had placed his faith in such orchestrations time and again.
He didn't have an alternative. He couldn't introduce reforms that would have met the needs of Spanish society. That would have been tantamount to negating the political work of a lifetime. And for Franco, that was out of the question.
A few weeks later, Franco suffered the first of several heart attacks. The general public followed his slow death practically live. Doctors kept him artificially alive for several weeks, until November the 20th, 1975.
Españoles, Franco ha muerto.
Half a million Spaniards paid their final respects to the caudillo. His mortal remains were laid to rest in the Valle de los Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen. Franco had had the mausoleum built for himself many years before. Spain and the rest of the world held its breath. What would happen now? Would the dictatorship also die along with Franco? Only 2 days after Franco's death, Juan Carlos was sworn in as the Spanish king and head of state. His most important mission was to find a future for Spain and its divided society. Juan Carlos would soon veer from the path laid down by his patron. Reforms were inevitable, but the pressing questions were, how far-reaching would they be? And how strong was the young king on whom all hopes rested? In appointing Adolfo Suárez as the Prime Minister, Juan Carlos took an important figure on board. Suárez was a former Franco supporter. Now, together with the king, step by step, he wanted to tread the path to a modern democracy. In summer 1974, free elections were held in Spain for the first time in 40 years. And an amnesty law was passed granting impunity for those who had committed crimes during the Civil War and under the Francoist regime. Then, on February the 23rd, 1981, Spain's future suddenly hung by a thread. Right-wing paramilitaries from the army and the Guardia Civil took over parliament in an attempted coup. But in the same night, the king endorsed the democratically elected government. He gave a clear rebuff to the rebels and Franco's political heritage. Some people had had little faith in Juan Carlos, but at that moment, he had saved democracy in his country.
The Spaniards, on the whole, didn't really want to go back to the Spanish Civil War. They wanted to fast forward into the future. And Spain's regeneration, Spain's modernization in such a short space of time, particularly in the 1980s, was an amazing achievement.
Under Francisco Franco, Spain had experienced the most difficult epoch in its recent history. The Civil War cost 500,000 lives. In the years that followed, hundreds of thousands more became victims of a reign of terror. Almost 40 years of Franco's dictatorship have left deep scars. Many of the guilty remain silent, while those who suffered are rarely listened to. Reconciliation remains a task for the present and the future.